Hi there, this is Roger Otten, your course coordinator for institutional investors. I thought, hey, let's do the following. We are now 2 weeks into the course, and maybe this is a nice moment for me to reflect on what we've seen in week 1 and 2. How should you take this? I would say this is a service to you, where I try to help you navigating the course. It might be helpful in between the different weeks to see the context of the stuff that we tackle, and I guess it also helps you in preparing for the test later this year. Okay, I think what I would like to reflect with you on most importantly is the fact that this course is called Institutional Investors. And I just want to make sure that you all see the big picture and what we're doing here in this course. So what we're doing is we're trying to replicate the investment process an institutional investor goes through. And this is a slide I used in the first lecture, and it kind of takes you through the different steps that an institutional investor will go through. And typically it all starts with the first thing that you have to figure out, what's my goal, what's my objective. And that can be very different. So for an insurance company, the objective might be that they accumulate sufficient wealth to pay out if one of their clients, comes to die, which means the insurance policy has to be distributed. The money has to be paid out. So an insurance company has a long-term goal, trying to make sure that there's sufficient money to pay out if a member indeed is checking in the life insurance. For individuals, it could be at the same time you're saving for a particular purpose. Let's say you want to have your kids go to college. So your objective would be, I want to save X amount in 20 years from now. For instance, a pension fund, and that's the example that I like to use regularly in this course, a pension fund's objective would be that the people who are member with the fund, as soon when they retire, we need to pay out a certain amount of pensions. So the objective of a pension fund is to meet these future payments. Now, these are what we call liabilities. And again, for a pension fund, that might be indeed future pension benefits. But for an insurance company, that can be a very different liability. So as soon as we know what the liabilities are, we have to make sure that we are able to meet these liabilities by investing. And how do we do that? We accumulate assets. These assets give you a certain return. And via this return, you try to meet your future liabilities. So it all starts at the first step, figuring out what I need to pay in the future and what kind of assets do I need to make sure I meet these liabilities that I have in the future. So that's the most important starting point, is matching the assets and liabilities. As soon as we know that, we know when do we have to meet a certain liability. So when we know when is our objective, for instance, 30 years from now, I need to know how should I invest the assets. That's something we call strategic asset allocation, or SAA. So this is typically where you think about how many risky assets do I want compared to more safer assets. So this is how many equities compared to bonds, for instance. So this is the point where you devise an asset mix, which typically is there for the long run. Right? Let's say at ABP, we regularly do this, and then we look forward about 15 years on how we should invest the assets to meet our future liabilities. So that's your strategic asset allocation. In the next step, you can deviate from that based on so-called tactical asset allocation, which means that you might go a little bit higher or lower in equities compared to your strategic goal. This is typically short-term, and people sometimes also call this market timing. As soon as we have decided how much to put in which asset class, you need to find a manager. That manager has to be hired to make sure the assets are actually invested in. So this is where you make choices on, do I go active? Do I go passive? Do I go for manager A? Do I go for manager B? As soon when you have selected the manager, that manager will go out and buy securities, something we call security selection. So that manager will make decisions on, do I buy Shell or do I buy Total? And finally, of course, the security selection has to be traded. So you need traders actually to perform this task. So this is in a nutshell the process that every institutional investor goes through. Whether it's a pension fund or an insurance company or a sovereign wealth fund or any other type of institutional investor, this is the process. And throughout this course, I'm using a pension fund as an example, but it is not a course on pension funds. This is a course on institutional investors and how they actually make their decisions. Maybe you now wonder, why is he using a triangle and it's upside down? Now, that's because of the following reason. There's been several studies on trying to find out which of these steps are now most important. And majority of these studies, and one of them I mentioned in the bottom right graph from the Financial Analyst Journal, actually shows that 91% of your result on the investment process, being returns, can be explained by asset allocation. And only a minor fraction is explained by security selection, market timing, or other factors. So what this means is trying to balance your future objectives with how I should currently invest, and typically on choices like, do I go into equities or go into infrastructure or go into private equity, has a much bigger impact on your final result than does your manager selection or your security selection. So in the end, choosing stock A over stock B has a very small impact on your final result. The biggest impact is strategic asset allocation. And that's important, and that's why I put this triangle upside down. So having said that, again, this course is about institutional investors. Still, having said that, I need an example. I need a sample investor. And I made the choice for a pension fund, and that's why in the first 2 weeks, we first cover some grounds on what is a pension fund and what are the challenges. And after these 2 weeks, we actually go into an investment process, but we first need to get some basic ground rules on the example that I use, and again, the example being a pension fund. So what I want to do with you in just a couple of minutes, reflect on what we did in week 1, reflect on week 2, and also give you a bit of context going forward. So what did we do in week 1? Again, I use a sample institutional investor, which is a pension fund. We covered in week 1, we looked at a basic pension fund system. And you saw, which I also repeated in the opening lecture, the typically 3 pillars. So you have your state pension, which is pay as you go, financed by taxes, very susceptible to demographics. Then you have your second pillar, which is your occupational pension, which is typically organized by the employer, which is typically based on a pool system. And then you have your third pillar, which is totally private. Now, we then looked a little more in detail into this second pillar, where we identified that there are 2 main systems of occupational pensions. We have the defined benefit and we have defined contribution. While defined benefit, as the name already says, it defines what you get. It's guaranteed by the employer, while on the other hand, defined contribution defines what you contribute. And there is no guarantee anymore by the employer. Then we also looked at challenges for pension funds as being institutional investors. And we saw that there are quite a few of them. Just to mention 3 here, one is longevity, that the average age is going up. We also have low interest rates and we have low returns. And as a result of that, we've seen that the basic system called defined benefit, or DB, is having severe issues. And as a result of that, we see more and more companies making the choice to going from defined benefit to defined contribution. Again, for the sole reason that this means that you're shifting the risk that used to be with the employer, you're shifting that to the employee. That's a system that in Europe is relatively new, but in the US this has been there for quite a while. And we also call it a 401k, which is just the name of the tax code in the US. It has been there for decades. Has it been a success? I would beg to differ. Just on the right, you see a small graphic, which is where they survey Americans on how prepared they are for retirement. And then they find out that half of Americans have saved less than 10,000 for retirement, which is of course hugely insufficient. Even more worrying is if you then ask people whether they think they're confident whether they think they're not confident about their retirement, only 1/3 says, I don't feel comfortable. So there is a big issue, but people are not aware of it. And putting that all together, about 87% of Americans don't even contribute at all to savings for retirement. And this is, to a large part, the result of the switch decades ago to defined contribution, where the risk is borne by the employees who can make decisions themselves, and as it turns out, they make horrible investment decisions, which is of course understandable because the average citizen is not trained to be a finance professional. You can be trained to be a doctor, to be an engineer, but not necessarily a finance professional. While in defined benefit, professionals run the fund, and in defined contribution, actually, you are running the fund yourself as an individual. And as you're not trained to do that, you will make mistakes. So that's what we looked at in week 1. We looked at different systems and we looked at the switch that's going on there. Then on week 2, we went a bit deeper. And again, we're going into this triangle from the top to the bottom. And we start to think a bit more about, okay, an institutional investor has a certain goal, has an objective. And you have to save early, start saving early to meet that objective in the future. For a pension fund, it meant you first of all have to determine your liabilities. That's the money you need to pay out in the future. And as soon as you have done that, you have to discount this future amount to the current, because you need to compare that to your assets, which are also valued today. However, we also saw from the paper by Botneruk and Bauer and Kramers, we saw that this can be manipulated. So if you, for instance, use a discount rate which is too high, it makes the liabilities look smaller. Why would people do that in the US, especially with public funds, to hide the deficit and also gamble for resurrection? What I mean with that is by having a very risky mix, you can use a higher discount rate, which lowers your liabilities, but at the same time, you're investing in a very risky portfolio while you're already having a deficit. So by doing that, trustees try to gamble for resurrection. That's the main conclusion from the article that you read in week 2, which we discussed on Monday. Then on Wednesday, we applied this to an assignment, and the assignment on PERS. And the setting was that we have Alison coming into this pension fund and realizing they're actually manipulating the discount rate. And by doing that, we're hiding a big deficit. So then you as a team had to advise Alison on how to remedy this. So you looked at different ways technically to remedy that, like to increase the discount rate. Sorry, not to increase, of course, but to increase the awareness that the discount rate had to be changed. In the end, probably it had to be lower. You thought about conditional indexation that you might hand out. You thought about increasing contributions and so on and so on. Something that you probably also talked about, but I just want to make sure that it gets sufficient attention as well, is communication. And pensions and finance in general can be a very complicated matter, not of course for you guys, but for people who are not studying finance. And so it's very important that communication is crisp, clear, that it's clear to the members what's going on. And also at ABP, we realized that. So what we have done already for quite some years is we've become very critical towards the letters that we send out to our members. They should be clear, they should understand the matters that we describe instead of asking more questions. And on the bottom right, you see a graph, which is actually from a UK pension fund called Nest, where they tried to come up with more simple terms for the typical pension fund, let's say, terminology that we use. For instance, instead of decumulation, they would say taking money out of the pension. So this would clearly resonate better with the average member, which is not a trained finance person. That's something we also tried to do at ABP, and we even took it a step further. What we did is this might be far-fetched for you, but we tried to figure out how people react to our letters. And what we then did, we had a pool of test persons who applied for this, and we made them read our letters. And while doing that, we were hooking them up with electrons, and we tried to monitor brain activity. We even at one point put people in an MRI scanner just to see if they read our letters, what's the impact on brain activity. And by doing that, we found out that there were, positive or negative based on certain words that we used. And interestingly, which was a bit of a bummer, we realized that the word that they hated most or they reacted most negative to in the letter by their pension fund is the word, now it comes, the word pension. So by using the word pension, a lot of people already, stop reading or become annoyed. So from that we learned that, maybe it's better to change the word pension and use it for, let's say, money for later. This might seem, a bit odd and funny, but by doing that, we realize that we can better serve our members by improving the communication with them. Another example, which I also wanted to share with you, is the one on the bottom left. It's in Dutch, but I'll walk you through it. We want to have our members that they need a better insight in how much money they actually have. And if they keep working with an employer that's hooked up with ABP, how much in the end can they save? Because many people say, oh, when I'm old, there's no money left. So we made a website for them, which they can go to and log in with their social security number. And it then shows them, for instance, the one on the left, which says that you're an employee, which you're now 10 years with ABP. And it tells you that at this moment you saved 86,000 euros and a bit more. And then it also shows you how that money is built up. Now, to start with, the employer, which is, in Dutch, it's werkgever, it's in the middle, put in 48,000 euros. That's the contribution of the employer into the pension fund. On top of that, you, which is the purple number, 20,000, also paid 20,000 in contributions. And then on top of that, that's the blue color. Yeah, blue is a color, of course. It also shows that ABP put in 17,000. Now, what is that? That's return. So in the end, 68,000 and a bit have been just by paying in contributions. And during these 10 years, ABP returned 17,000 euros extra, which is put into your money pile. If you then would stay working with an employer that is with ABP, which would be, typically a policeman, a fireman, or a teacher, then at the point where you retire, your pension pile would be in excess of 400,000 euros. And over time, you see that the impact of returns, which is the blue part of this graph, becomes bigger and bigger. And this is because of, interest on interest. So each return that we make, we put back in your money pile, and year on year that grows. And this is something that we use in our communication. And it's key in communication that your members know how much money there is and also understand the letters we send them. And that's something I just want to share with you, as an application of the things that we talk about. Okay, so these were my reflections on week 1 and 2. What happens next week? So actually that starts tomorrow. We now understand the goal, which is meeting your objective, which can be different for pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth. What's now important is how do we reach that? So this week we start by how can you invest the assets to meet the target? And that's again going back to the pyramid, which was upside down, the triangle. We call asset liability management, where we try to balance out the liabilities with the assets and making smart investments to meet the liabilities. And this holds for all types of institutional investors. That's it for me. I hope this is helpful for you. Good luck and see you later this week. Bye.